For generations, the sprawling acres of land by the river had belonged to the Hanley family. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was heritage, stretching back to a time when the land was raw and untamed, long before the town of Clearbrook was even marked on maps. Old surveyors' documents, weathered deeds, and the family's careful stewardship kept it alive. It was mostly forest and marshland now, dotted with thickets of oak and aspen, and sloped toward a wide, serene river that curved like a silver snake through the valley. There was nothing spectacular about it to the untrained eye, but to anyone who knew the area, it was one of the last unspoiled stretches left. Ethan Hanley had left Clearbrook for most of his adult life, working in the city, investing wisely, and only returning during holidays to check on the property. He had built a modest cabin on the western ridge decades ago, a place where he could breathe away from the press of modern life. The land required little, just the occasional clearing of fallen branches and a watchful eye on the old floodgates built by his grandfather, remnants of a now-defunct irrigation project. Those floodgates had once supplied the nearby farms with life-giving water. Over the years, with farming gone and the land's purpose forgotten, the dam became little more than a quiet sentinel, holding the river steady during spring thaws. It was only when Ethan received a series of strange property tax notices in the mail, oddly formatted, with the wrong acreage listed, that his curiosity sharpened into concern. The numbers didn't match his deeds. His land, on paper, appeared to have shrunk. And in its place, a new development name appeared in small legal print: Willow Creek Meadows, Phase 2. He drove out the following weekend to see for himself. The sight stunned him. Where once there had been his fields, clearings, and stretches of wildflowers, rows of near-identical beige and taupe houses now stood, 35 in total, their driveways freshly paved, their sod lawns unnaturally green. White vinyl fences ran where deer trails once meandered. Mailboxes bore family names he had never heard. Children's bikes leaned on porches. SUV tires left tracks on what used to be his wild grass. It was not only a theft, it was an erasure. The homeowners association that governed Willow Creek Meadows was as smug as it was unresponsive. Ethan's letters went unanswered for weeks. The few phone calls that made it through were met with vague deflections. There must be a clerical error, you'll have to speak to the developer, we're sure it's all been legally acquired. The developer, meanwhile, claimed everything was in order, citing outdated county plat maps and permits signed by officials Ethan had never met. He sought records from the county office, only to find a tangled mess of paperwork, misfiled surveys, rubber-stamped approvals, and a transfer that should have never been allowed. It was as though his land had simply been willed into someone else's hands without so much as a signature from him. The injustice burned deeper with each passing day. Those families who now lived there were not villains, they were buyers, tricked into believing they had purchased legitimate homes. But the HOA, its board of 3 residents led by a sharp-eyed woman named Claudia Barrington, was not innocent. They had filed the permits, hired the lawyers, and secured the construction, knowing the land ownership was under dispute. They had gambled that Ethan would not fight, that the cost of reclaiming what was his would outweigh his resolve. They were wrong. For now, Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not storm into meetings or confront the residents. He walked the edges of his land quietly, boots sinking into the muddy banks, tracing the old boundary markers hidden among the brush. He still had the original deeds, ironclad, notarized, unbroken by any legitimate sale. The dam, standing like a relic from another age, loomed in his mind more with each step he took. Its gates were heavy with rust but functional, designed to hold back the river during spring melt or release it when the farmland needed flooding. He began to see the layout differently now. The cluster of homes sat directly on what was once the natural floodplain, raised only slightly but not nearly enough to withstand the force of a full river surge. The developer had ignored the flood maps. The HOA had paved over the warning signs. They had planted their investment right in the path of a river that could be unleashed with the turn of an old iron wheel. But Ethan was not reckless. He spent weeks collecting every piece of evidence: satellite photos from before construction, surveyors' lines, testimonies from old neighbors who remembered the original fence posts. He hired a property attorney, who, upon seeing the mountain of errors, warned him, yes, the law was on his side, but the fight would take years, maybe decades. Courts moved slowly, and developers were shielded by deep pockets. Meanwhile, the HOA sent him a letter threatening to fine him for trespassing on his own land. It was in that moment, reading their smug warning on his own porch, the paper trembling in his weathered hands, that his decision began to crystallize. They wanted a war of paperwork. He had no patience for it. They wanted to pretend his boundaries did not exist. He would remind them where those boundaries lay. The autumn rains came early that year. The river swelled, licking at the edges of the retaining wall near the dam. He checked the mechanism twice, oiling the rusted bolts, turning the wheel just enough to feel the tension in its ancient frame. Downriver, the lights of Willow Creek Meadows twinkled in the dusk, their cul-de-sacs quiet, their sprinklers hissing, their children playing soccer on ground they believed was theirs. He thought of the decades his family had preserved this place. He thought of the arrogance it took to build without asking, to pave over someone's legacy and call it progress. And he thought of the coming storm, forecasted to linger for 3 more days. The river rose another inch that night. By morning, the air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Ethan stood by the dam, his hands on the cold metal wheel, listening to the rumble of water pressing against the gate. 35 homes sat where they should never have been. The rain did not stop. It came in slow, persistent sheets, tapping against the cabin windows and soaking the fields that had been disturbed by bulldozers and concrete trucks. Ethan watched the forecast carefully, not because he needed it to tell him what was coming, but because it gave him a measure of time. The river was a living thing, and with each passing hour it swelled, claiming back what it had been denied for years. Its banks strained, its surface rippled with a strength that only those who had lived beside it for generations could truly respect. Downstream, the residents of Willow Creek Meadows went about their routines, unaware of how fragile their new foundations were. Their HOA newsletter for the week boasted about landscaping plans, Halloween decorations, and new speed bumps. Not a word about the storm, not a mention of flood preparedness, no sandbags by the doorsteps. They believed in permanence because they had been sold permanence, a promise of suburban stability built on land they did not truly own. Ethan spent the following days in preparation, not in panic. He moved the few valuables from his cabin to higher shelves, secured the old generator, and marked the levels on the retaining wall with chalk. The dam had been dormant for decades, but its mechanics were simple. A wheel, a gate, a channel of stone carved by his grandfather's hands. When closed, it tamed the river. When opened, it allowed the water to return to its floodplain, to soak the earth and replenish the marshlands that had once flourished there. The decision weighed on him, but not with guilt. The law had failed him. The county had failed him. The HOA had mocked him. They had fined him for walking on his own property. They had taken something irreplaceable and turned it into cul-de-sacs and vinyl fences. And when he tried to address it civilly, they buried him under bureaucracy. His family's name had been on that land for more than 100 years, and they had erased it with a single surveyor's stamp. So he turned the wheel. It was not a violent moment. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, the metal grinding as it surrendered to the motion of his hands. The river's song deepened, its pitch changing from a whisper to a murmur, then to a low, steady growl. The release was not sudden, it was patient, like water always is. It crept first, sliding over the edges of the old channels, seeking the paths it once knew. The marsh grasses downstream welcomed it greedily, drinking in the excess. The earth, long deprived of its seasonal flood, began to soften. The first night passed without notice. The HOA board members slept in their cul-de-sac homes, dreaming of property values in committee meetings. The second night, a few residents noticed the river was higher than usual, but they assumed it was the storm alone. By the third day, the lawns near the lower row of houses had turned to slick mud, and the storm drains gurgled with water that had nowhere left to go. Ethan remained invisible, a ghost in his own land. He watched from the tree line, rain dripping from his hood, as the homeowners began to worry. Cars were moved to slightly higher ground. A truck tried to bring in a pump, but the water kept coming, inexorable and brown. The HOA president, Claudia, walked the neighborhood with a clipboard and a false sense of control, promising her residents that everything was under the developer's warranty, that the county would respond, that they had insurance for this sort of thing. But the county did not respond. The developer was suddenly unreachable, its office phone lines going to voicemail. And the insurance adjusters, when they finally came, shook their heads at the paperwork and the missing permits. The floodplain maps did not lie. Willow Creek Meadows was not supposed to be there. It never had been. As the fourth day dawned, the water pooled deeper, licking at the edges of patios and warping the pristine fences. The children were sent away to relatives, their bicycles left behind in the wet grass. Moving trucks lined the main road, but there was nowhere for them to go. The HOA sent a letter to Ethan, frantic this time, demanding he stop illegal manipulation of water flow, and threatening criminal charges. He read it once, folded it neatly, and set it on the table beside the original land deeds that bore his grandfather's name. The dam creaked as it settled into its new position. It had not been forced open all the way. Ethan was not cruel. He was methodical. The land would not be destroyed, it would be reset. The marshes would return, the willows would drink deeply, and the deer would cross freely once more. The homes, built hastily and without respect for the floodplain, would suffer. But that was the natural course of things when arrogance met the slow patience of water. By the end of the week, local news had taken notice. Reporters in raincoats stood ankle-deep in murky water, broadcasting live shots of the inundated neighborhood. Words like mismanagement, illegal development, and land dispute began to float across the screen. The HOA looked for someone to blame. The developer blamed the county. The county blamed outdated maps. No one blamed the river, though it was the river that had the final say. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Lawsuits would follow, certainly. There would be legal challenges, demands for compensation, threats of arrest. But in the meantime, the water was doing what it had always done, reclaiming its path, washing away the lines that had been drawn in arrogance. Each passing day left the homes a little less secure, their driveways cracked, their lawns submerged, their basements dark and damp. And in that slow chaos, something else began to shift: the residents. They stopped listening to Claudia's promises. They started asking questions, looking into deeds, demanding to know why no one had told them about the true owner of the land. Some packed their belongings quietly, leaving their homes behind before the worst could come. Others stayed, hoping the storm would break and the water would recede. It would, eventually, but not before it made its point. The rain stopped on the 8th day. The sky cleared to a pale, washed-out blue, and the river glinted like a silver blade under the weak autumn sun. Ethan stood once more by the dam, boots in the mud, watching the flow with the same calm as before. He had not destroyed anything. He had simply let nature remember what it was meant to do. Yet even he knew, this was not over. The HOA would not surrender quietly. There would be court orders, cameras, accusations of sabotage. The developers would return with their lawyers, and the residents would want their losses covered. They had trespassed on his heritage, and now, in their desperation, they would try to make him the villain. The wheel still sat in his hands, ready to turn further if needed. The waters lingered like a ghost that refused to leave. For nearly 2 weeks, the once pristine streets of Willow Creek Meadows were scarred with pools and rivulets, their manicured lawns turned into sodden wastelands. Furniture sat piled on driveways, wrapped in plastic, while moving vans idled in half-flooded cul-de-sacs. What had once been marketed as a dream neighborhood now looked like an evacuation zone. The HOA's emails had grown more frantic, more accusatory, with each passing day. They no longer spoke of landscaping plans or community events. They spoke only of blame. News crews had swarmed the area, their cameras lingering on the worst of it: warped fences, cracked foundations, water lines creeping halfway up garage doors. Every broadcast mentioned the same phrase: built on disputed land. Ethan's name, though never officially released, circulated through whispers. The locals remembered him, the quiet man with the cabin, the one whose family had always owned the lower marshlands. Now, his silence became a narrative for others to twist. A recluse turned saboteur, a bitter man lashing out at progress, a villain flooding innocent families for revenge. But the truth was not so simple. Court documents had begun to surface. County records, decades old and inconveniently clear, showed the property lines that had been ignored. The developers who had sold the land were already backing away, their office emptied, their lawyers issuing carefully worded statements about clerical misunderstandings and pending litigation. The HOA, once so confident in its authority, found itself isolated. Its president, Claudia Barrington, was seen pacing her porch in the early mornings, her clipboard gone, her phone pressed constantly to her ear. The residents were fractured. Some, realizing the homes were built on stolen land, turned their anger toward the HOA board that had failed to do its due diligence. Others, too deep in their mortgages to walk away, clung to the belief that Ethan was the true enemy. They petitioned for his arrest, for charges of property damage and endangerment, but the sheriff's office, when presented with the old deeds, stepped cautiously. There was no trespass when the land was his. There was no vandalism when the water followed its rightful course. Ethan watched it all unfold from the edge of the forest. He had no need to gloat, no urge to taunt. The land was speaking louder than he ever could. The dam's gates, partially open, allowed the river to breathe again. Birds returned to the reformed wetlands. Frogs croaked at dusk where manicured lawns had once stood. Nature was healing, though it was a slow and indifferent healer, unconcerned with property values or wall lawsuits. As winter approached, the waters began to recede naturally, leaving behind a terrain altered beyond quick repair. Silt layered the streets. Mold crept into drywall. Foundations cracked where the earth had softened beneath them. Insurance companies, upon closer inspection, began to deny claims. The fine print was clear. Properties built on unapproved floodplains were not covered for preventable water damage. The residents turned desperate. Some abandoned their homes entirely, leaving behind curtains that still swayed in the broken windows. Others stayed, their savings dwindling as they fought both the elements and the courts. And then, the county made its move. In late November, a formal notice was issued. The development of Willow Creek Meadows was declared illegal. The permits were revoked, the deeds voided, the HOA dissolved pending investigation. What had been built on shaky foundations, both legal and literal, was undone with a single stamp. The land, by court order, was returned to its rightful owner, Ethan Hanley. But the return was not a celebration. It came with debris, lawsuits, and the bitter taste of vindication delayed too long. Ethan inherited a scarred landscape, dotted with half-abandoned houses and angry remnants of a community that had never truly been his. The HOA, once so proud and loud, now filed its complaints in courtrooms instead of newsletters. Claudia herself was summoned for questioning, her promises unraveling as quickly as the sodden lawns she once championed. The final act was not the water. It was time. Over the winter, snow blanketed the remains of Willow Creek Meadows. The cul-de-sacs became silent under the frost, and the abandoned homes stood like skeletons against the pale sky. In spring, as the thaw came, Ethan closed the dam's gates slightly, guiding the river to its natural rhythm rather than its unleashed force. The land would not be barren forever, it would breathe again, in its own way. The remaining residents, those few who had neither fled nor sued, eventually approached him not with threats, but with weary resignation. Some asked to buy their plots legally, this time with his signature on the deed. Others requested to stay until they could find new homes. He allowed them, quietly, under his terms. Not because he owed them, but because the land had already punished their arrogance enough. The viral story that the world came to know was not of a man who flooded a neighborhood, but of a neighborhood that ignored the ground beneath it. Commentators online turned it into a parable, about greed, about bureaucracy, about the unstoppable patience of nature. Ethan never spoke publicly, never gave interviews. He let the dam, the river, and the scars in the earth speak for him. By the second spring, the development was gone. Most of the homes had been dismantled or relocated. The roads were pulled up, the fences torn down, the land reseeded with native plants. Willows sprouted again where the water lingered longest. Deer returned to graze in the evenings. The marshes, fed by the careful rhythm of the dam, spread out like a green-brown tapestry across